Hey everybody, Jim the Tabletop Engineer here, and welcome to a new episode. This is not a crafting episode. Those come out on Wednesdays. I'll probably be releasing this on a different day. But what this video is about is I had the opportunity yesterday to play my first game of Stargrave by Joe McCullough, right here. Stargrave is a sci-fi skirmish war game built on a similar rule set as Frostgrave, if you're familiar with that game. I got to play my first game yesterday against my opponent, Todd, here in Atlanta. Now, Todd and I had never played before. Now, I've read the rule book twice, maybe 3 times now, and Todd had read it a couple times, I believe. But even then, we still found ourselves having to reference the book quite a bit, and that's normal with learning a new game. But in this video, what I want to do is I'm gonna cover various topics that pop in my mind related to yesterday's game. These aren't critiques; these are just observations that maybe will help you when you play your first game of Stargrave. But also, it's very possible that Todd and I misinterpreted a rule here or there. So it will give you an opportunity to ask questions or feedback, give us feedback on what we were doing. As this video progresses, I'll try and throw some photos up from that game. I took quite a few. They won't have any kind of explanation with them, but they'll at least give you an idea of the game we played. Let me get started, and these are in no particular order, but hopefully they will spur some discussion with all of us Stargrave players. Okay, when thinking about yesterday's game, the first thing that comes to mind and kind of makes me laugh was right before we played Stargrave, we had played a game of Frostgrave. Now, in Frostgrave, the game is broken up into phases. There is a wizard phase, then an apprentice phase, then a soldier phase, and then a creature phase. Those phases are pretty much identical in Stargrave, but what we kept doing was we kept saying, okay, now it's a apprentice phase. No. In Stargrave, there is a captain phase, a first mate phase. There is a soldier phase, which is the same as in Frostgrave, and then there is a creature phase, same as in Frostgrave. What Todd and I kept doing wrong was referencing the phase by the wrong name. Todd had mentioned that probably was because we had just played a game of Frostgrave. Very true. But I still think, based on, I've probably played well over 50 games of Frostgrave, probably more than that. Those phases are just built into my head, wizard, apprentice, soldier, creature. Now we have 2 new types, captain and first mate, and so it was very hard to get the naming right. Frequently, both of us would say, okay, time for wizard phase, captain phase, and I think other Frostgrave players may have that similar thing happen to them. If I continue to play both games, I don't think that's going to go away. I think I'm still going to call the first phase the wizard phase, and when I'm playing Stargrave, I'll probably call it wizard phase, or I may call captain phase in Frostgrave. There's going to be some confusion there. And that's okay, because as long as you and your opponent understand that wizard equals captain, apprentice equals first mate, and so on, it should be fine. But I just bring this up because I'll be curious to know if others who play Frostgrave have this initial reaction to the game by misinterpreting the phase or miscalling the phases. Okay, let's talk about terrain. I have a ton of Frostgrave or fantasy setting terrain because I play Dungeons and Dragons and Frostgrave and a few other fantasy games that I need that kind of terrain. But I have been building up my sci-fi terrain to a point, but I certainly don't have as much of it as I do the fantasy stuff. Now, yesterday, Todd brought some terrain. I had agreed to bring the Frostgrave terrain, and Todd had mentioned that he would bring some sci-fi terrain. So I could have brought mine. I didn't have a lot of it, and I've got to keep working on that. But Todd brought 2 types of terrain. Both of it is paper in nature. One of it was a thin cardstock, a little heavier than normal paper, but not like cardboard, still thin. He had some stuff from the Infinity Corvus game, I believe. I'm not familiar with that game, so I apologize if I messed the name up, but it was Infinity related, and it was very detailed. I mean, the images that were printed on the paper were very sci-fi-ish and colorful and vivid. The pieces were they weren't stable or sturdy. One of the pieces was a 2-story building, and the paper, curved, and it was bent down, and it didn't quite square up properly. It felt very flimsy, and it was, because it's thin cardstock. It was suitable, but it wasn't as good as the other stuff that Todd brought, which I'm very fortunate that he brought what's called core space terrain. Now, core space, if you're not familiar with it, this is core space. I have the game, and I actually have some of the terrain, and I totally blanked on it because it's not the traditional terrain that I use for war games. It's cardboard, it's assembled, and it was great. It was very solid, and it looks good, and it has that sci-fi flavor to it. And he brought quite a bit of it, and it made me realize that I already have quite a bit of sci-fi terrain. Now, when I play core space, I play it solo, and when I'm done, I typically break the terrain down because it's meant to be taken apart. I'm starting to think that what I'm going to do is I'm going to glue this stuff together so it's not so, it really doesn't come apart, but I think over time pieces may loosen up. So I'm going to take this core space stuff and glue it together and get a big bin to keep it in. And I think that's going to be fine for sci-fi terrain. Like it's more urban city type related. If I need sci-fi terrain like out in the country or jungle or whatever, this probably won't work because most of it is very clean looking. So if you're going for that aesthetic, the core space terrain is probably not going to do it for you. But I like it, and it really helped our setting look that way. We didn't have any goal in mind. We just threw the pieces down and used it to create a sci-fi setting. We weren't playing any particular scenario, so there weren't any special buildings or call-outs like that. One thing you're going to have to keep in mind is if you do not have sci-fi terrain, you're going to need to either start making it or invest in some, like the core space stuff. I don't know of any pre-painted sci-fi terrain that's hard like plastic. I have mentioned that the Dungeons and Lasers has this sci-fi core set. These are plastic walls, but they have to be painted. Now, there's plenty of sci-fi terrain that you can 3D print. My friend Tom Tullis over at Fat Dragon Games has a lot of sci-fi terrain that you can you pay a flat price, you get the files, and then you can print as much as you like. There's walls and ships and just all kinds of stuff. Even miniatures you can get that you can 3D print if you don't want to buy miniatures for Stargrave. Just keep in mind, if you have not yet played Stargrave, if you don't have access to a gaming store, that was the other thing. We had plenty of sci-fi terrain at the gaming store we were playing at. Now, most of it was 40K terrain. And that has a very gothic look to it. You recognize 40K terrain immediately when you see it. We weren't going for that, but that's certainly an option. If you have it, use it. But I'm not a big fan of the 40K sci-fi terrain except for a 40K game. So you're going to have to look for options for terrain if you don't already play a sci-fi skirmish game or war game and have a whole bunch of it. So just be prepared. Now, I mentioned this because this moves into my next point. Stargrave can be played on a 2D surface. You can just put buildings and walls and obstacles that you have to weave around and stuff like that. But this brings up an interesting point that I learned about yesterday's game. Stargrave is much heavier on the ranged combat. As a matter of fact, yesterday during our game, Todd and I had no melee contact between our miniatures. Everything was firing weapons, grenade launchers, throwing grenades, whatever. It was all ranged attacks. Now, with Frostgrave, you have spells, which can be ranged attacks, and you have crossbows and arrows. But most of the soldier types that you use during the soldier phase, those soldiers have to get in close. They have to get in base-to-base contact to fight with another soldier or attack the wizard or apprentice or whatever. But you got to be in base-to-base contact. With Stargrave, almost every character, just about every character that you can have in your warband has a ranged weapon, whether it's a pistol, a carbine, a laser pistol, a grenade launcher, you name it. There are some sword weapons, okay? There are some, I'm trying to remember, I think there's more than one weapon that can be used in melee combat. As a matter of fact, you can use your standard weapons as melee weapons, and there's rules for that. But the one thing that Todd and I quickly discovered in this game was close hand-to-hand combat is very difficult to do in Stargrave, because as the distance closes between you and your opponent's minis, unless you are constantly hiding behind walls or whatever, which is fully possible in Stargrave, you want to use your ranged weapons. I mean, a ranged attack in Stargrave has no repercussions to you other than the grenade launcher, which I'll talk about in a second because I learned that the hard way. In Frostgrave, if you fire an arrow at your enemy, they just roll a fight roll to see if they dodge it, right? Now, when you're in base-to-base contact, you both roll, and if your opponent rolls higher than you, even if you instigated the attack, you can take damage or get killed, and you were the one that started the combat. With ranged attacks, that doesn't happen. You fire, and if you miss, there's no penalty to you. And so with Stargrave, what we quickly discovered was ranged attacks they're the name of the game. Why get into close combat with one of your more expensive soldier types and risk attacking in hand-to-hand where they could just as easily kill you? It's much easier to take the shot. So most of our 99% of our combat was ranged weapons, projectile weapons. I used a grenade launcher one time. I missed. With grenade launcher, you pick a point. You specify a point, and there's a template for there's a smoke grenade, and then there's a fragmentation grenade. I was using the fragmentation for area damage, and it's a smaller template than the smoke. The smoke is a little bit bigger. Fragmentation's a little smaller, but you pick a point. And that is where the template is placed. And then if it hits anyone within that circle, you make an attack against them. But first you have to accurately fire the grenade. I did not. When you miss, you roll another die. First off, by how much you miss. Let's say your target roll is 12 or 14. For every point that you miss, let's say it's 14 and you roll a 10. You missed by 4. That's how many inches the grenade is going to move in a random direction away from the point you placed, up to a maximum of 6 inches. Once you determine the distance that the grenade missed the point, you roll for a random direction. I rolled in a random direction that was to the left of my firing character and the target, so it went this way. It could easily have come back at me, and 6 inches was well within I fired it within 6 inches. I would have been doing a +3 shooting attack against myself and my first mate, who happened to be they were both within 2 inches of each other. So that would have been a very bad ending for 2 of my warband members. But outside of the grenades, and the thrown grenades work the same way. Outside of grenades and the grenade launcher, all the projectile weapons pretty much work the same, including the flamethrower, which has just a really amazing distance. Neither one of us got a chance to use the flamethrower, by the way. I didn't have a warband member that had one, so I cannot speak to that. But I can tell you that because the game was so heavy on ranged weapon attack, that's going to lead into what I originally was going to discuss here. 3D terrain. One of the things that with all the sci-fi terrain we had was there were a lot of blind areas where you could not see an opponent from the ground level. But Todd had a sniper that was, probably about 10 inches off the ground. We didn't measure it, but he had a high vantage point. Now, the other part about it was his guy was more than half hidden. He was always getting to add +4 to his fight roll because of that intervening terrain it was providing him a heavy cover. I did take some shots at that sniper, but he was hard to hit. And it made me realize when from that vantage point, he was seeing beyond the roof line. There was one building that had about a 3-inch roof, And he was able to see over it and down to my characters that normally would not have been targeted from a two-dimensional or from ground level. As I started thinking about that, I realized that now Frostgrave's the same way. You get a player up high, like an archer or a crossbowman, you can have that kind of thing. Fantasy terrain, a lot of times fantasy terrain is ruinous. You don't have a lot of towers. You can, but players don't spend a lot of time shimmying their characters up, because you get there's a penalty for every 1 inch of movement up a wall climbing. You spend 2 inches of movement, so it's a 2-for-1 trade-off. With sci-fi terrain, a lot of it has staircases or ladders and things that your character can climb without that 2-to-1 penalty. In Frostgrave, now maybe not with your terrain, but in almost all games I've ever played in Frostgrave, when you want to get to a high point, you have to climb. Because most Frostgrave players that I play, we don't have characters or warband members going inside towers and using like an unseen staircase. I've played games where we had a house rule that when a warband member entered a tower, for each floor, that was 6 inches of movement. So you had to keep track. Okay, he's on the second floor. Now he's on the third floor and he can come out. With sci-fi terrain, a lot of times you have walkways, catwalks, and staircases to get to higher points of ground. And I think that's going to come. I think we're going to be seeing a lot of Stargrave games that are heavy 3D. A lot of your I keep saying characters. A lot of your warband members are going to be at different elevations, mainly because sci-fi terrain just seems to lend itself to easier access to higher levels. Could be wrong. Your terrain, your sci-fi terrain, may all be one-story type or just walls where there's no getting a higher vantage point. But I will tell you that sci-fi terrain to me looks coolest when it is all, when you have catwalks and towers and things like that. So I do think we're going to see a lot of Stargrave games that use more 3D elements in terms of combat and terrain, but combat is where it's going to be. So if you're going to be playing Stargrave, you need to keep in mind snipers are going to be very deadly from high points where they can get that distance and see your warband members that are hiding, or you think they're hiding, but they may not be. 2 snipers at 2 different points on the map are going to be very crazy to have to deal with if your opponent is doing that. If you're running multiple snipers, the downside is they're expensive. They need that high vantage point to get their maximum value to your team. But again, I just mentioned this because it just popped in my mind. I think terrain is going to become very important to Stargrave games. Could be wrong, but that's where I saw yesterday's game going. Okay, another aspect of Stargrave that differs from Frostgrave is loot. Now, in Frostgrave, if you can get a warband member to a loot treasure chest or whatever tokens you're using for it, they pick it up. They don't have to open it. They pick it up, and the goal is to get it off the map in order to gain access to whatever is inside that loot container. With Stargrave, there's an extra step. You have to unlock the loot. Now, there's 2 types of loot. There's physical loot and there's data loot, but they both operate the exact same way. A warband member must be in base contact with that loot token, and then you make a will roll with a target number of 14. Could be 12, but I think it's 14. I'm not going to spend time to reference the rulebook, but let's just assume it's 14. So a standard soldier who has will plus 0 must roll a 14 or higher to unlock that loot token to get it. Now, there are certain tools that warband members can carry. Like there's a thing called a deck and another thing called picks. The picks will give you +4 or +6. Again, I'm new to the game, so apologies I don't have these memorized. But there is a bonus if you have a warband member that has that tool in their slot list. They gain a benefit, a bonus to that roll. I think it's +6. So now you need to roll an 8 if you have that item in your hand. But again, if you're unlocking a physical loot token with a pick, you get the +6, not the deck. The deck is for the data loot. Unless you have a warband member that is carrying both a deck and a set of picks, you're going to be sending one of each type, or a warband member that has neither, to intercept those loot tokens. Because remember, the point of the game is not really to eliminate the other opponent, although that is what a lot of people play for. If you're playing in a campaign, it's all about getting the physical loot and the data loot. The physical loot gives you new weapons, new armor, things like that. The data loot gives you coins, or money in the world, and it can also give you information that has a value. So in order for your captain and crew to move up in the world, you need to be collecting physical loot and data loot in order to get the money and the weaponry and the armor to fight stronger opponents, because your opponent is doing the exact same thing. So now you have this extra step where you've got to unlock the loot tokens before you can take them off. I found this yesterday to be problematic because I had a one of my warband members is called the Codebreaker. He has a deck. I sent him straight to one of the data loot tokens because he had the tool that would have the +6 to roll that target number. But for the first physical loot token I came across, it was just a standard soldier type with no bonuses. I could not roll the 14. I attempted it twice. Now, our game didn't last very long. I had to roll a 14 or higher twice, and on both times I failed. So he's sitting out there in the open trying to unlock this physical loot token, and he can't do it, and that counts as an action. Now remember, you get 2 actions. You have an action that's like a shoot, unlock, whatever, and you have a move. So once he fails the unlock, his only other option is to move. So I was having to take him and move him into hiding, and then on his next turn, move him back, and then do the unlock. Well, if the unlock fails, he's stuck. He already did his move action, so he's out there in the open. You're going to have to think about this strategy of how do you approach loot tokens with what warband member, and how do you do it in such a way to leave them, you're leaving them exposed. If your first action is a move towards a loot token and you fail the unlock, you are stuck. Now, granted, the loot token might be behind a building or inside a building or something like that, but typically you and your opponent are placing loot tokens out where they can be seen. The rules didn't state that you have to do that, but you don't typically put loot tokens inside a building that is covered that you can't see the loot token. They're typically placed, I think it's just an unwritten rule between players, they're typically placed so that you can see them. Now, granted, you can put it near a wall, but even then, if you move and fail the unlock roll, you're still out in the open if a certain player moves one of their warband members to where they have line of sight. So it just made me realize that entire extra step of having to unlock the loot tokens really shakes the game up. We didn't play, we had to call the game early. We played about an hour and a half before we had to end it. We had played Frostgrave prior, so we ran out of time. So I managed to take out one of his soldiers. He managed to take out one of mine, and our captains were just taking damage, but thankfully neither one of us lost a captain. But I think if the game had finished all the way to the end, one of us was going to lose a captain, because my guy was down to 5 or 6 health, and I think his was down to maybe 8 or 9. I mean, we were beating up on each other's captains. All right, now after having read the rulebook 2 times, I may have totally missed the bar on this. So if I have, be nice and correct me in the comments or reference the rule page. But here was a thing that really surprised Todd and I. In Frostgrave, you have spells. A wizard or apprentice casts a spell. They have a target number. If they miss that target number, they take damage. If it's if you miss it by 5 to 9 points, for example, you take 1 health point of damage. But the wizard or the apprentice can do what's called I can't remember the word. It's early. They can sacrifice health points to bring that roll up. So if you missed it by 3 points, you can sacrifice 3 health points and make that spell cast successful. It succeeds, but you took damage, right? Okay, now in Stargrave, not every power, but a lot of the powers, especially the really powerful powers, they have a thing called strain. Now, the powers have what's called an activation number. It's the same as a target number. You roll that number, and if you succeed, the power is cast, and if you fail, nothing happens, unless it has a strain value. If you succeed on the power, you also take damage. The strain, if it's 1 or 2, you take 1 health or 2 health off of your captain. If you fail the roll, it's the opposite. There's no penalty, no strain damage. Now again, I could be wrong. Maybe I missed something in the rules. But Todd and I looked and we could not find it. It is a difference between Frostgrave and Stargrave. Your captain can use those powers, as much as he wants. First mate too. But until the power is successfully cast, you don't take strain damage. And a lot of the powers have strain 0. So whether you succeed or fail in using that power, there's no damage to you. That was an interesting one because our captains, we were throwing powers all around. Mainly because since we've never played the game, we wanted to test out. In a Frostgrave game, my wizard will bring 8 spells to the table, and I'll typically use 3, maybe 4 of them. Yesterday, I believe I used every one of my captain's powers. Now, maybe that will change as the game progresses, and I realize that those powers aren't as useful as I thought they were. And given that there's there's 8 powers, I forget, there's something like 50 plus powers in the book. It's going to take a lot more games for me to play to both use powers and see how my opponent uses powers. So given that I've only got 1 game under my belt, I cannot really talk about specific powers and their value. Maybe that'll be a follow-up video months from now. You're going to have to spend some time familiarizing yourself with these powers, but you're going to have to get it in your mind, if I'm correct here, that there is no cost health-wise to using your powers unless you cast them successfully, which is the opposite of Frostgrave. I don't remember being a novice Frostgrave player. I just, in my mind, I know the spells, I know their target numbers, or at least their effects if they're cast successfully. Because Stargrave is so new and I haven't played but 1 game, the powers we were frequently having to reference. I mean, I printed out, there's a free reference sheet on the Osprey Games website, and I'll try to remember to link it in the video description below, where you can download the power cards. And what I did was I printed them out, and then I cut them out and laminated them just on a single sheet so I wouldn't have to lose these little cards. I didn't want these cards flying all over the place. I also didn't want to have to reference. So I just cut out the ones I used and laminated them. The powers, I constantly had to keep rereading what do they do? That slowed our game down. I think we would have finished our game if we hadn't, each of us, Todd and I, been having to reference, what does this power do? And what, sometimes you have to interpret the rule, okay, what did that mean? That will improve as I play more games and as I see more opponents and their powers being used. I'll gain a better understanding of powers and counter powers and things like that. Okay, I didn't want this video to go as long as I think it's going to go, but it just occurs to me there was a lot to decompress after that game and think about, and so that's why I decided I wanted to make this video, not just for you but also for me, because talking through these things makes me realize when I read that rulebook again, there are certain sections that I really want to pay attention to because they were so fuzzy at yesterday's game. Ultimately, the question is this: after my first game of Stargrave, how do I feel about the game? Well, of course, I'm grinny because I love Frostgrave. Frostgrave is just one of those games that the first time I played it, it just clicked. I was like, this is just so fun. And I can honestly say out of the 50, 60 plus games of Frostgrave that I've played over the last handful of years, I don't think I've ever had a game that I didn't enjoy. And I had a game a few weeks ago where my entire warband got wiped out. That was the first time. I mean, I lost every warband member. But Stargrave, I like it. I mean, I will tell you this. I read more science fiction books than I do fantasy books. I just enjoy science fiction more than fantasy. I read a lot of fantasy when I was younger in middle school and high school, but my tastes changed and I like sci-fi. I also tend to watch more sci-fi movies than fantasy movies. I loved Lord of the Rings. I loved those kind of fantasy settings. But give me a sci-fi movie any day, even a corny one, and I just like sci-fi. So I have been anxiously awaiting Stargrave, and now that I got my first game under my belt, I'm loving this. I hope that I get to continue to play Frostgrave and Stargrave equally, although I really feel anxious to play more Stargrave. I've played a lot of Frostgrave. Now I want to play a lot of Stargrave. The other thing I really want to do is I now want to start playing the solo. I love playing solo games. My family doesn't play a lot of games, so a lot of times if I can't find an opponent, I want a solo game. Stargrave has solo rules. Joe McCullough released something called Wanted, Dead or Alive, which is a free supplement. I'll put a link below if you don't know about it. That provides some scenarios for creating these bounty hunter type scenarios where your warband is going after a bad guy, and there's rules related to capturing and things like that. But it allows for solo play, and I have to pitch in my own solo game. I've got one called the Derelict, which is a 5-part solo campaign that I'm putting in my Bexham's Bazaar magazine each month. Part 1 of 5 came out in the May issue, and it's just my take on providing. I had an advanced look at the rule book, so I knew the rules and the gameplay, so I was able to develop this 5-part series. Hey, listen, Stargrave is fun. Joe McCullough has made another great skirmish war game. Should you play Stargrave? Absolutely. Get the rulebook. It is now out. I believe you can get the PDF from the Osprey Games website if you just want a PDF and not a print copy, although I do like having the print copy for quick rules referencing like we did yesterday. It's fun. I'm going to play a lot more, and I'm going to share a lot more battle reports over at the Tabletop Engineer Facebook group, and probably on the official Stargrave group. I'll share photos and things like that. I plan on making a lot more terrain, a lot more. I mean, I really need to make a lot of terrain if I'm going to invest in this game. If you play Stargrave, and have played already, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments about your gameplay. If you know that I made some rule mistakes in explaining here, please correct me and reference the page numbers if you can. I hope that some of what I've said in this video will help make your game a little easier, maybe help you prepare for your first game or your next game, and also just encourage you to go read the rulebook and really dive in, because it's not just a simple matter of saying, oh, it's Frostgrave rules. There are enough differences in the rule sets that you just can't do that. You can't go into a game just showing up and saying, oh, it's Frostgrave, I'll just roll the same rolls and stuff. The powers are totally different. Some of the mechanics are opposite of what you would think they are. So read the rulebook, play some Stargrave, and I hopefully maybe I will get to play you at conventions like Mace or Southern Fried Game Expo. Again, links below to those events. All right, everybody, this is Jim the Tabletop Engineer. Take care. I'll see you in the next video.
Each month, Bexham's Bazaar RPG and Wargaming magazine provides gamers with articles, props to print and cut out for players, mini adventures, new monsters, and much more. Look in the description below for details on how to get a few free issues so you can see what you're missing.